It is my pleasure on a number of occasions that tonight to be part of this dinner and support ASPI, Peter Jennings and his team, and also to sponsor that the dinner as Lockheed Martin Australia particularly. We're on the cusp, if the media is to be believed, Kim Bergman, very good, the media is to be believed, on a great maritime decade ahead of us. The Air Force has had their go, which is terrific, and now it is moving towards the maritime space. White paper, sometime first quarter 16, and the politicians have been very direct with us and said it will have the maritime focus. We're going to rebuild the Navy in, arguably, and just talking with Alison down here, arguably the fastest time that a fleet has been rebuilt in the Western Hemisphere for an awful long time. So we in Lockheed Martin, of course, we've got a mild interest in this, as has a lot of the defence industry people here gathered here. But the man who's got the responsibility of setting this ship off on its course is Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, the Chief of Navy. Tim's been the Chief since July 14, so already 18 months into it. You'll recall he sort of had not quite as grey hair at the start, and I look forward to seeing how it goes in the 4 years' time. But Tim brings a particular focus and a technical background to this role. He been joining the Navy way back as a seaman officer, very early saw the light, some would say, and went into aviation, but never quite forgetting his seaman side. And his later career, as he went on to become the fleet commander, for example, wearing those wings, but with that technical background of aviation, airworthiness, and a seaman's perspective, has given us the fleet that we have today, and more importantly now, he's going to give us the fleet that we look forward to the future. So Tim's got 5 points that he makes, and he's going to stress them again today, and he talks about the Navy and about the parts of getting the fleet, why we need a Navy and why we should never forget why we need a Navy, and overcoming a term that sometimes we use in the Navy and the ADF called sea blindness, and the concept of fighting for a fleet when people don't understand why we need a fleet. So Tim talks about deterrence, he talks about lethality, but then he talks also about availability, sustainability and affordability. And they are the things, particularly from an industry point of view, that we have to pay attention to and make sure that our Navy is supported in the way that we can do that. And all of us in this room, of course, have responsibilities on the first two and understanding and overcoming that sea blindness side. So Tim's going to speak to us tonight on the concept of shipbuilding enterprise as we roll into what could be a most exciting decade, if not the most exciting decade, for the Royal Australian Navy as we roll through into the future and the future fleet. Tim, can I ask you to address us, please?
Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Raven was once my commanding officer, so I was expecting actually a lot worse. Thank you. Part of my speech this evening, or my discussion this evening, I was going to mention, some of you have heard me say it before, about asset management, and I was going to use Qantas as an institution to just show how you meet availability and all sorts of things, but sitting on the table at the moment, and Stephen Loosley tells us he was delayed getting here because Qantas cancelled another flight, so I might just scrap that from my conversation, or please give me the name of another airline and I'll think about that. Look, I do wish to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the lands on which we meet, and might pay my respects to their elders past and present. But I'd also like to acknowledge overall the contribution of Indigenous Australians in the Royal Australian Navy over the last 100 years. And I say that, and I do ask those of you who are still on the subscription list for Navy News, our newspaper, will have seen a tremendous photograph on the front page of one of our young sailors playing the didgeridoo at the Remembrance service here in Canberra on a very wet day last week, but he sounded perfect, and to me that is a true manifestation of recognition of what we expect from our proud young sailors, and it was great to see him do that. I'd now like to thank ASPI and also Lockheed Martin for this White Ensign dinner and the opportunity that I have tonight to be able to address you. This is indeed the third successive year in which the Chief of Navy has been invited to speak at this dinner, and I am honoured to be able to be given this opportunity. and there is so much to discuss. It is important, I think, to highlight, as Raiden has done, and as I talk through here, I think he may have looked through my folder because some of the language that was used was some of the things I was going to try and say. But let me just say it is important to highlight that we are on the cusp of a strategic change for Navy that arguably only occurs about every 100 years. The debate is not on whether the Navy is to be rebuilt and expanded, but rather on how we achieve this complete recapitalisation of Navy over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. Importantly, 2015 is the year that saw this government announce that continuous shipbuilding will be a permanent feature in the nation's industrial landscape. Now, surely that is not an outlandish notion for a maritime nation. To understand why that decision marks the beginning of a new maritime and naval era, I will briefly just look back over 100 years of the RAN's existence. Let me start by reflecting on the writing of my learned colleague, Rear Admiral James Goldrick, who's here tonight, in a speech that he gave to the Australian Naval Institute in 2011. He spoke of the Navy and the way that its capabilities have been developed over that time. He suggested that the last century saw the progressive evolution of 4 generations of Australian fleet units. Each fleet unit was designed to meet fundamental changes in both the strategic environment and in the contemporary technology of naval warfare at that time. He opined that we are now at the start of a 5th generation of national naval capability. This assessment, though fundamentally simple and obvious, is of profound importance. 4 years on, I contend, we are well advanced in the move to this new 5th Fleet Unit, a 5th generation Navy. The leap in capability that we are currently making can be compared to that which was achieved with the 1st unit in 1913, centred on the battlecruiser Australia, but including, at the time, 2 new long-range submarines. But also relevant to the 3rd Fleet Unit of 1948, which included the light carrier Sydney. And as an aviator, when we do look back at the growth of the Fleet Air Arm, it originated from that time, and it was a fundamental change in how our Navy operated. But I would like to argue that the 5th Fleet Unit is an even greater advance, both relatively and absolutely, because it affects so many areas of warfighting and operations, and because it will be integrated and networked with Air Force and Army and with other defence assets to a much greater degree than ever before. Let me emphasise here that this is very much about a joint effort. Indeed, it is an endeavour beyond joint, because its achievement involves very much more than just the 3 combat services. Getting the enablers of intelligence, communications and logistics right will be the core to achieving our success, a view that I know is fully shared by my fellow service chiefs, the Vice Chief and CDF himself. That said, you only need to look at the ships that form the vanguard of our change to understand the magnitude of what is being done, and not just by the Navy. The ships Canberra and Adelaide will allow the Australian Defence Force, and I say that with purpose, the Australian Defence Force to deploy and project both hard and soft power around our maritime region and around our own coasts, in many ways and in many different contingencies, to a degree with which, and a level of confidence with which we've never previously enjoyed. We've already achieved a level of capability with the company strength amphibious ready element, which will provide us with a more robust and sustainable amphibious response than at any time in the ADF's peacetime history, a capability which we will have real utility in humanitarian assistance and evacuation operations. I ask you to remember the last time I spoke at ASPI, we didn't just buy it for HADR. But let me say the amphibious exercises off Cowley Beach in August this year, with HMAS Canberra, exceeded our expectations. Just yesterday, I declared her to be ready at initial operating capability. We will commission her sister ship, Adelaide, next month in Sydney. And with that, we will continue the certification process of the full ADF amphibious capability. With the full battalion-based battle group, that is the core of the amphibious ready group, we will have the potential at relatively little notice to deploy substantial combat power from the sea, something which has already been repeatedly proved so important in the stabilisation operations which we have conducted in the region. In terms of maritime combat power, we already have a taste of what is to come with the modified Anzac-class frigates. Their new CA radar, which is very locally produced, I'm pleased to say, and the combat systems are world-leading technology that will allow our surface forces to operate with a much greater degree of confidence against an airborne anti-ship threat. Now, this is just not idle speculation. HMAS Perth's performance at the Pacific Missile Range Facility in Hawaii last year proved the worth of the recent modifications and demonstrated the Anzac's capability as an escort for the LHD. That said, Anzacs are approaching the limits of their development margins, and the government's commitment to the future frigate is indeed timely. As an aviator, I am well pleased with the introduction of the MH-60 Romeo. It is now at sea in the Anzac class and is a leap in anti-submarine capability, a tremendous asset which the most modern submarines will find hard and difficult to counter. It also provides new elements of anti-surface capability in its sensor fit and with its Hellfire missiles. It could not be more timely. As I speak here tonight, we have a fleet concentration period happening off the east coast of Australia where a number of our submarines are involved in rebuilding our latent fleet ASW capabilities. Now, like many others, I eagerly await the arrival of the new air warfare destroyers. I have made my point before about the delays in this project, and I won't repeat them here. But this capability is critical if we are to meet the demands that the government has placed upon us when we operate in the region. The DDG will provide a capability to dominate the maritime battle space through their Aegis system and their SM-2 missiles in a way that we have not seen before. But importantly, very importantly, this will also be a capability that will complement and be complemented by the Air Force's Wedgetail. The ability to share sensor and tracking data that these two major platforms bring to the battle space will allow them to capitalise on the future capabilities of the long-range SM-2 and its successors to an unprecedented degree. No longer will our anti-air weapon range be confined to the radar horizons of our surface ships. A cooperative engagement capability is essential across the ADF and indeed across our allies. This is an important point. I have talked elsewhere of our need to focus on the lethality of our systems because it is lethality which creates combat power and true deterrent effect. And it's not about the vulnerability of individual platforms to individual weapons. It's about a systemic approach to collective defence and offence. A force centred on the air warfare destroyer and our other seaborne elements, supported by Wedgetail and other airborne systems such as the JSF, Super Hornet, Growler and the P-8, will have the ability to dominate an area in which it operates. The Collins submarines, and I'm happy to say we have for this year, and to dispel some myth, we've had 50% of our fleet operating for large periods of this year at sea, are now providing greater availability than they did 3 or 4 years ago, and I ask you to think back what that was at the time. And their successor will also have an equally significant role to play, whether operating independently to attack and destroy or in support. We are developing in some, or what we are developing in some, is a maritime capability which will be able to operate as a coherent national task force, or as a major element, and often a leading element, within a coalition. It will be a collective capability that will be able to deal heavy blows to an adversary at very long distances. But it is clear that the maritime warfare challenge is becoming even greater as long-range anti-ship missiles proliferate and submarines become ever more common in the Asia-Pacific. And we've heard it before, over 50% of the world's submarines in our region by 2035. And as remote sensors, satellites and unmanned air vehicles become available to more and more operators. To maintain the edge and to have a true deterrent effect, we must be ready to take the tactical offensive. We need to have the ability to use what has long been termed the knowledge edge, to reach out and destroy the adversary before the latter can use their weapons upon us. This requires a combination of enablers platforms and systems that I've been describing to you. It's where Jericho meets Pelorus and indeed Beersheba. It's a thought process as much as anything else. It's what joint force design will be all about and what we seek to bring to pass under the First Principles Review. Now, even though we've achieved a lot already in moving towards our 5th Fleet Unit, I'm well aware that many challenges remain, and many of these relate to our capacity to progress this complex recapitalisation. I am monitoring the progress of the air warfare destroyer. Hobart is in the water and fitting out, with a planned acceptance into service of 2017. Brisbane is getting ready for launch, and I laid Sydney 5's keel this month at ASC. Well, I placed the coin under the keel, but traditionally that's what I did. The reform program is underway, and it will strengthen the ability to improve productivity in ships 2 and 3. But we need to ensure that the lessons of this project are not only applied to getting it back on track, but to everything else that we do in the future. Now, I am enthusiastic about the prospect of a sustained, national and effective shipbuilding program. I said program, not project. There is a distinction, and it is important. And this program will be one that allows Navy to reach and maintain the levels of capability that it will need in an increasingly complex strategic environment. But I'm also acutely aware of the point that has recently been emphasised by the Minister for Defence. As she said recently, Australia cannot afford a shipbuilding industry at any price. And to continue with her words, the Government, the Department of Defence and Australian industry, working with selected international partners, will need to work closely together to develop a plan that ensures we can deliver these 3 critical defence capabilities: frigates, offshore patrol vessels and submarines, in a manner and a way that meets schedule, cost and capability requirements. That's her ring just to thank me for saying those words. Looking around this room, I think that her remarks apply equally to this audience. There are many here who will be helping to make this happen. And at this point, let me stand here in front of you and commit Navy to doing its best to ensure that, in seeking to get the capabilities we need, not want, but those that we need, when we need them, and that we will help and not hinder the defence organisation or industry in doing so. I met with members of industry last week at the Submarine Institute of Australia down in Adelaide, and yesterday I met others in Canberra to talk about my priorities and to reaffirm the need for shipbuilding to be a national enterprise undertaking with a 50-year horizon, not a 5 or 10-year horizon. I stress the key relationships I see between deterrence, lethality, availability, sustainability and affordability. Each part affects the other, but overall it ties industry to Navy inextricably, and we need to be that linked. But it is affordability that must be emphasised at a time of lower economic growth and competing claims for funding. I realise that. Andrew Davies and Mark Thompson have reminded me, and others, of that, pointed out that the difficulty of ring-fencing money for defence. But surely the real question is, can Australia afford not to build the Navy that will meet the current and future needs? Defence budgets in our region are rising in relative and absolute terms, and new ships and submarines are being launched every month, and in some cases every week. The precautionary principle requires that Australia has a fleet that keeps pace with those in the region, because we cannot know where and under what circumstances our ship will be operating in the 2020s and beyond. That is not going to be easy, but the alternative is a slow withering of the vine of our maritime capability. It is my view that continuous shipbuilding now provides us, for the first time, an opportunity for evolution to become the underpinning factor in the strategic calculus of our fleet's design and its delivery. In this vein, the fleet unit, the modern fleet unit, can continuously evolve in a managed, deliberate and affordable manner. Why? Because we will truly embrace the nation as the owner of the Navy. Gold plating a one-off solution will become an outdated phrase, as evolution and continual improvement will permeate our capability planning and our national psyche. We can now view sustainability, availability and affordability through a new and different lens. Perhaps we will stop asking how much something costs and ask ourselves what an investment is worth. And whilst we're at it, let's take a business approach to sustainment, to workforce management, to basing and to our infrastructure needs. We need to think differently about how we approach this. We are already working to make sure that we can meet the government's commitment to an ambitious continuous naval shipbuilding programme. There is indeed a lot of work to do. If I talk about the offshore patrol vessels, the date for cutting steel, and many have heard me and seen me do this, is cut steel in 2018, the date set by government, while the first of the future frigates will be 2 years behind in 2020. This schedule is, to say at least, very, very tight. To meet the OPV deadline, we will be building an existing design, with only very few necessary changes to meet the contemporary needs of the ship's maritime security roles. But it is being built to replace the Armidale-class patrol boat. We have neither time nor need to be making non-essential changes which will add cost and cause delay to the OPV programme, particularly in the key area of detailed design work that has been the source of so much trouble in the past. We need disciplined and deliberate action. I've got a joke here. It says, "Now I can all see your eyes roll when you hear a senior defence member say that, or even make that suggestion." But the evidence suggests that we have done this recently. Indeed, these are the very things that have reinvigorated the seaworthiness concept within Navy, which was necessary following the decommissioning of Kanimbla and Manura, a sad and poor time in Navy's history, recent history. Current disciplined approaches have been seen, and we now see ship availability increasing dramatically. I've talked about submarines, but I would also offer HMAS Success and Tobruk as great examples. Threefold improvements in their availability through a disciplined approach to what we're seeking to do. Now, the OPV competitive evaluation process, as I've said, has already started. It needs to, because our fleet of Armidale patrol craft, which the OPVs will replace, are displaying the whole wear and tear that is the result of the hard lives they have lived on border protection and patrol duties over the last near decade. For all intents and purposes, if I've said Gesundheit, I should say it in French and Japanese as well, given the spirit of cooperative engagement at the moment. For all intents and purposes, excuse me, I was interrupted. The competitive evaluation process for the future frigate has also commenced, and we are not short of international contenders for that programme, and decisions will need to be made sooner rather than later about which design we will choose to build here in Australia. I repeat that government requires us to start cutting steel on the first future frigate in 2020, and I am confident that we can do it. But to do so, we will need to think differently about our approach to acquisition and to asset management. We will need to embrace new concepts. Some of you have heard me say it before, Ship Zero, the co-location of all those functions that are needed to produce availability in a ship, and the sorts of things that Qantas often do well. Sustainment in design, true asset management. We need to consider new basing arrangements and manning concepts, and I am up for all of these. We need to be agile and we need to be innovative, and I put out my innovation statement about 3 months before the current Prime Minister put his out. There are opportunities here for us to rethink how Navy contributes to the effects required by the ADF of its Navy. That is my commitment, innovation and agility amongst Navy's thinking. Most significantly at this time, when we start building the future fleet, we will not stop. Think about that. This will be a national enterprise, which will provide the Navy with new and better ships at regular intervals, the drumbeat we've heard so much about, not just once in a generation, but indefinitely. Think about it. But while I'm at it, I'll mention the future submarine competitive evaluation process as well, as it's moving into its next stage, or will be shortly. The government's preferred system is for the combat system is the United States submarine combat system and the Mark 48 Mod 7 torpedo. Whichever of the two contenders is selected as the combat system integrator will represent not only a key element of the future capability, but a key source of continuity in the Collins system. It will allow us to build directly upon much of the technical and tactical experience that we have built up in recent years. Now, my emphasis on the importance of the enablers in generating lethality and real combat power would not be complete without mention of the project to acquire 2 new replenishment ships. We expect to select the winning design and builder next year. Apart from the benefits of being a single type, the pair will be a considerable advance on the capabilities of the Ageing Success and the converted Sirius. These ships have done great work, but it is time to move on if we are to provide our maritime forces with the reach and the persistence that they require to evolve a true task group capability. So there you have it, the recapitalisation of the Navy. But as important to me is the opportunity it presents for us to rethink sustainment, basing, manning, and our industry relationships. Now, each CN has challenges to face. We all have our challenges. I consider myself most fortunate that many of my challenges relate to the speed at which we need to build new ships and prepare the Navy for the rest of the 21st century. But we need to change attitudes and behaviours in our workforce. We need to change our thinking. We need to change our way of doing business. And I see this occurring incrementally at the moment, but the momentum is starting. Our sailors are enjoying the new ships we have already commissioned and are looking forward to the future fleet coming out of our shipyards. I hope I have demonstrated tonight that Navy is on course to take command of and operate the future fleet. I am confident that with consistent backing and funding of this government and its successors, we will meet the need for security at sea required of us by the Australian people. We are an island nation. We will have a fleet that can continue to meet the Navy's mission to fight and win at sea. Now let me close with a quotation from my predecessor of the immediate post-World War II era. The man as much as anyone responsible for the conception and creation of the 3rd Fleet Unit that I talked about earlier, based on the fixed-wing aircraft carrier. Admiral Sir Lewis Hamilton wrote, "A navy does not drop from the clouds. It is a miraculous and delicate instrument, a creation of nerves as well as steel, united with blood as well as rivets. It is in many ways the greatest expression of a nation's genius." 70 years later, his words still ring true. Thank you. Almost got away with it.
Nearly. Well, thank you, Tim. That was a compelling address. We have time for some questions, about a quarter of an hour for some questions to our guest of honour. Perhaps I might begin, Tim, by just focusing upon that last quote of yours, which was superb. Blood and rivets. We're looking at the 5 principles: deterrence, lethality, availability, sustainability, availability. Where do our people fit into that? What are the challenges in training the future men and women of the Navy?
Thank you, Stephen. There are, first, the people are at the forefront of what I've described, and it is glib when a lot of people say lip service is paid to saying that people are our most important asset. Navy has struggled for many years with our ability to provide enough people with the training that's needed to operate the fleet we currently have. But when I look at how we've done those things, we have always looked back at the methods and tinkered with the changes to be able to produce something. I have a completely different vision as to how we will train our people so that we optimise the equipment we'll be using. If I could use an example, if you go to Singapore and you have the opportunity to go to the Maritime Police Unit down near Sentosa Island, you'll see an extraordinary building there which starts at a schoolhouse and ends with a 3/4 size tanker built into the wharf with a swimming pool large enough on the landward side for you to run a 7.6 metre rib, rigid inflatable hull, alongside that supertanker to practice things. And they take people with no previous experience from the street and they enter at one end of that building, and 3 months later they finish qualified, competent and ready to go in the task that has not used any of their vessels at the time. It includes at least 3, possibly 5, my memory fades, full mission, full visual simulators, things that are normally attributed to airlines that you would use to train aircrew and pilots. It's a methodology that they've selected which, and I've met people who come out of the other end, it invigorates those who go through the training. It optimises the equipment that is needed, so you are not using large parts of your operational force to train people in basic needs. And as a consequence of that, and a different view that they approach to it, they manage their workforce differently from us, but in a far more effective way. So we have struggled in the past. It is my aim to show, with the equipment that we've got, but changing the methods by which we choose to deliver this outcome in the future, that we will meet those manning requirements. And if I could just end with another quick story, and those of you who know me know that I'm full of them. When HMAS, well then, new ship Canberra came into Sydney for its first docking last year, it came alongside in Garden Island, went into the dry dock, and it was reported that at the administration area within HMAS Cuttables, where we manage our sailors, there was an enormous spike in the number of people who revoked their discharge. That is, people who were seeking to leave the Navy. And that lingered. And so I think that we have been given an opportunity here. If we think differently about how we train, we've certainly been given the stuff that those that would seek to join the Navy can now see there's a future for them. It's the greatest recruiting tool I think we have at the moment.
Thanks, Tim. Now we're open to questions. Could I ask people to identify themselves, please? There's a gentleman there at the back with his left hand up.
Chief David Grove from the Age and Sydney Morning Herald newspaper. You better watch out that your Gesundheit remark isn't seen as a Freudian slip.
That's why I correct myself with both,
yeah,
whatever it is.
Do you know the Japanese for?
I don't know.
I'm glad you mentioned the dynamic duo of Mark Thompson and Andrew Davies, because they're among the prominent experts, including Warren King and probably a few other people who can't put their names to their views all of the time, who have raised concerns about the competitive evaluation process and choosing one bidder immediately rather than down selecting to 2 and letting the process run and the bids and the designs to be refundable. I just wonder, as the guy whose people will be operating these things, whether you have a view on that.
I'm comfortable with the competitive evaluation process as it stands at the moment. My comfort is supported in some of those experts that I have looked to who have provided advice that it can be delivered in the way that we expect to. We fully acknowledge that there are risks involved, as there would be in a number of different ways that we could produce this outcome within the time that we've got to produce it. The issue is having an understanding of how we manage those risks and making, I believe, deliberate and defensible decisions. I think it can be done.
Another question. I think there's a question here.
Admiral Kim Bergman, another reptile of the press. Thank you for that. 2 quick questions. C-1654, I just wondered what it means about Navy processes that I guess we collectively got into the position of having to go for a fully imported offshore build for that project. And to follow up on my colleague's question regarding C-1000, what's going to happen if the 3 proposals are so indistinguishable in their excellence? Is there scope for going forward with 3 or 2, if that should be the case?
In answer to the first one, it was a government decision to build the ships overseas. I will always say, as the capability manager, I need capability that I can sustain and my successors can sustain for 25 to 30 years, the life we would normally expect to operate ships. I need all the elements that will allow me to sustain that in my hands. I need design intent, I need to understand so that I can manage obsolescence, so I can manage modification, so I can manage the upkeep of the vessel through its life. I'm not going to use the word that I'm build agnostic, because a predecessor of mine said that got booted, but not booted, got kicked. For saying that, I should say. So the decision was made elsewhere. If the opportunity arises that 3 excellent solutions come forward, what do you want me to say? I would be delighted. The challenge then would be clearly to ensure that the process we've got in place is discriminating enough for us to be able to consider all those elements. And one of the important ones for me is around the business end, and this is why. And a lot of people have said to me, "You don't speak enough about warfare, Barrett." But I come back to the view that if you don't gain availability, then you're just not able to produce the warfighting effect that any government would need. And I've often used the statement to say 6 very good Collins-class submarines alongside is not a deterrent. So if we have 3 very good solutions, I will be looking for those discriminators around maximising availability. And it might well be that it comes down to those that show business process that will confirm in my mind how I'll be able to deliver that sustainability to maximise availability throughout their life. I'll be one of a number of people who will be having a say when those come through.
We shall have a non-reptilian question from Congressman.
David Feeney from Her Majesty's Law of Opposition. I was interested in the OPV, and I was wondering if you could perhaps give us a fuller sense of the capability requirements that you envisage.
Sure.
Is it sort of more LCS? Is it more Armidale? And do you see it sort of doing the hydrography sort of modular job?
Yep. I try to make the point in the presentation. It will replace the Armidales. That's a statement of fact. It is larger than the Armidales. It will be larger than the Armidales. Not because it's going to be assuming a great deal of new role or capability, but if you look at the role that is performed by the Armidales at the moment, working now, and you'd know previously I was a Commander Border Protection Command, so I have a sense of what is required to do. But in the contemporary sense, the task upon the Armidale is challenging, far too challenging. It is spending more time in areas away from the Australian coastline than we anticipated. It needs greater seakeeping qualities to do the tasks it needs. It needs to be able to carry more people to do the tasks it needs. It needs to be able to carry equipment, which, in using it in a patrol boat, will mean that I will not have to provide other ships of the fleet to do the task that we've been forced to do with the Armidale at the moment, because it cannot meet necessarily all of the contemporary tasks. So the design principle around the OPV is very much for maritime security, for border protection. It is not developing a new tier of warfighting capability.
We have time for 2 more quick questions.
So can I, if I may, and just moving back, and the other concept that we did have, and we still do hold, is that that particular class of ship, whilst principally and in the first stage will be for border protection operations, using a common system of management and design would also be suitable then to move, the platform would be suitable to move into things like mine countermeasures and indeed hydrography or survey. Each of those being done in the future with remotely operated equipment, not with what we may have looked back in the past and said it has to be a ship of a certain hull construction, etc. It is not being designed. Well, I can argue for those latter 2 certainly it's not been considered at this stage that it would be a dedicated ASW platform. But I'd like to make a different approach here. For me, and I am an ASW helicopter operator, so I can say what I like about submarines and everything else. The issue for me, ASW is not just about submarines. It's not just about the tail that you have in a ship. It's about every asset contributing to theatre ASW, an awareness of what is happening beneath the water. There are many ways that you can do that. Many ways you can do that. I would never say that any ship that we operate doesn't have some capacity in some form or another to contribute to the ASW scenario of trying to determine the underwater domain awareness. Thanks.
Two more brief questions.
It's terrific to know that we've got 3 alternative submarines that are coming up. At what point, though, does your operational capability trump strategic other issues, such as, for example, Japan and China have an interesting relationship. To make the decision to go with the Japanese version would be a courageous decision, I submit. It would be implying that we're part of a US-Japanese alliance. At what point do these sort of issues overwhelm the technical capacities of the vessel? Or is, as with the combat system, is this a vital part of the decision?
Working backwards, the combat system is a vital part of the decision process. The ability to fit and manage that particular combat system is essential. And I said in my presentation that it's as much about looking at the relationships we have formed and where they will go moving forward to consider that, as it is in the technical aspects of the combat system itself. To go back to your first point, when will that point of the strategic considerations be made? I would assume when the government makes a decision on which submarine they choose. We will provide strategic context. The white paper does that. We will also consider and present to government a view of the technical superiority of a submarine among others, and the government will make that decision.
There was a hand. A lady here.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Rayner, the Office of the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Dr. Andrew Lee. If I could ask you a fairly broad-ranging question. We were fortunate enough in the Parliament today to hear from the Israeli chief scientist who was talking about the role that investment in defence innovation has played in building a broader culture of innovation in Israel. What role, if any, do you see for the kind of investment and the kind of innovation that you're talking about, specifically within Navy, in building a broader culture of innovation in Australia?
Look, I think we've been delivered an opportunity into our laps, not to fiddle and try with innovation. If we don't do things differently, we will not get cutting steel in 2018 for OPVs and for 2020 for frigates. It will just not occur. If we continue to do the things that we've done in the past, it will just not happen. At the same time, the opportunity to look at how, and this is why I'm focused on sustainability, we can look at how we match and mirror the requirements in a business sense for how we'll be operating these ships in 20 to 30 years, which will drive different ways of managing them. I'm always using an example. I use it for Plan Polaris, which is my strategic plan, which I've tied to my tenure here in Navy. We have a tendency to consider where we are right now, and we look forward and try and forecast things. And every time we do that, we put blinkers on and we consider the circumstances that exist at this time, or we look back for the policy statements we've made in the immediate past, and we try and project where we want to be in the future. What I'm saying we have the opportunity now is for me to project forward and say, by 2025, I can tell you what Navy will look like, because government has told us we need future frigates, OPV. I can tell you how many bunks will be needed at sea. I can tell you, with a fair tolerance, how big each of those ships will be. What I'm trying to tell people in my organisation and more broadly within CASG and other parts of defence is we're going to sit as if we're in 2025 and ask the question, how the hell did we get here? And if you think like that and you look back, at how you got to that point, you suddenly actually open up the lens and you start realising there are many ways to get to that particular point. And as soon as you do that, you start thinking about different ways of doing it, innovative ways of doing it. I'll use one example if I may. As I said, I've got plenty of stories. I'll use an example of, we've had workforce issues in the past. I raised that with in answer to my first question. I've asked my people to think that to imagine themselves in 2018 and imagine they're in one of those new LHDs and it's at sea and it's doing the task so well that we expect it to do. And in one of those machinery control spaces, there are 3 petty officers, as we call them, and they're all marine technicians and they're doing what's required to be able to run that ship, a complex ship. Now, one of those, I imagine, has been through all of the traditional training methods, and they've come through and it's taken years to get those qualifications, and they've been in uniform the whole time. And there's probably been some hiccups along the way, but anyway, they get there. But now they're qualified and competent and they do the job. I think they're probably going to be sitting next to someone who probably left the Navy 6 or 7 years ago and went to join the mines somewhere in far north Queensland or over in the northwest. They've probably got all their skills in the oil and gas industry and a whole bunch of things. And they've seen what I've been saying about the future Navy and they've demanded to come back in. And in the old way of doing business, we'd probably say, yes, but you left 6 years ago and we haven't seen you. So you're going to come back in at the same skill grade, the same pay grade, the same rank, and all those sorts of things. Well, we can't do that. We need to say, no, you've got all those skills, you're here, we're going to put a uniform on you at the rank, relevant to your competence, based on what you've gained elsewhere. And the third person sitting there, she's working in Qantas at the moment. She doesn't know that in a year's time, we are going to headhunt her, and we're going to put her in that position, because she will be signed on for a certain period of time, because her sole role will be to send that ship to sea for a period of time. Now, that's 3 different ways of managing a workforce thing, and at the moment, traditionally, if we sit in 2014, we'll only look at one way of doing it, and that's the traditional method. So I'm trying to provide, across a whole range of things, a view that says, think ahead and then look back as to how we got here. And in doing that, you will open up a whole range of innovative thinking. So I'm trying to drive it through Navy. At the same time, we need to drive the same way that we look at the acquisition process through CASG, through Capability Acquisition Sustainment Group. And at the same time, DSG, Defence Science and Technology Group, DSTG, they're right to follow those sorts of principles. Now we've got real purpose to be able to drive those sorts of decisions. So it's not just innovation because we think we have to, it's innovation because we damn well have to do it. I spoke to you.